Something very sick and evil is happening in Israel's jails, and almost nobody is talking about it. Israel is running, and let's be absolutely explicit about this, a system of torture camps. Welcome to hell is not an exaggeration. 9 Israeli reservists sodomized by inserting metal objects up the anus of the prisoner and causing terrible internal injuries.
This is leaked CCTV video of what Israeli military police allege is a detainee being sodomized as he's hidden from the view of security cameras by riot shields.
They were arrested, taken away to a detention center where there was an enormous outcry. And there was actually an invasion of the detention center, including politicians, in support of the Israeli soldiers.
שיש מי שבפרקליטות חושב שאפשר לבוא ולעצור חיילים על דברים שעושים למחבלי נוח'בה, לא נגמר. אנחנו לא יכולים להמשיך כרגיל.
להכניס מקל לרקטום של בן אדם, זה לגיטימי?
כן, אם הוא נוח'בה, הכל לגיטימי לעשות לו. הכל! הכל!
In Israel, the reaction is it right to sodomize prisoners? This conversation went on breakfast television. It's sort of their equivalent in Israel of GMTV.
מבצעים עבירה, חשודים בעבירה של אינוס, בעצור כפות. זה לא מעניין אותך?
בגדול, עוד פעם, זה מעניין לי את העכוז מה עשו לאיש חמאס הזה. אני כל הזמן זוכר, קודם כל, הדבר היחיד שמבחינתי הוא בעיה פה, זה שזו לא איזושהי מדיניות מוסדרת של המדינה להתעלל בעצירים. כי בגדול, זה גם, קודם כל מגיע להם, וזה אחלה נקמה שאנחנו צריכים לתת להם. ודבר שני, אולי זה גם ישמש אותנו קצת יותר כהרתעה.
So you have Israeli TV pundits discussing the merits of allowing Palestinian prisoners to be raped. Many members of the cabinet are justifying it. Take the example of the Israeli energy minister, Eli Cohen. Reservists who do holy work and guard the despicable Hamas. Itamar Ben-Gvir, who is the security minister, went even further.
Take your hands off our reservists, like it is in the prison service, so it is in the IDF. Our fighters deserve full support.
This tells you that something has gone wrong, but it also tells you that something's gone wrong with us. Haven't we heard a word of condemnation from the British Prime Minister, Keir Starmer? I haven't heard it. Nothing from Rishi Sunak, who promised Netanyahu his unequivocal support. Nothing from the Shadow Foreign Secretary, Andrew Mitchell. Nothing from Britain's Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, who famously said, on no evidence at all, that Hamas had raped babies.
And we must recognise that Israel is facing a huge existential crisis. 1,300 people dead, murdered, babies raped.
And yet he has not yet said one word of condemnation of the treatment of Palestinians in these, what can only be called torture camps run by the Israeli state. And I think that means that we accept them. Imagine how we'd be reacting if this was emerging about Putin treating Ukrainian prisoners. You can imagine the frenzy of outrage. You don't get it when it's committed by our ally, Israel. And I think that shows that we have done the same as the Israelis. We cannot see Palestinians as human beings. To behave in this bestial way towards Palestinians is not regarded by the British media as disgusting and foul and inhumane. It's just, to use that code word, it's been normalized not just in Israel, but in Britain as well. Imagine we learnt, the British people tomorrow morning picked up the papers and discovered that prison officers had been systematically sodomizing inmates in His Majesty's prisons. It would be a national outcry. That would be a sense of utter horror. You know, you get the Sunday Times investigation team would be in that. The Sun would be having a screaming headline sort of denouncing the way that it was being handled. The Prime Minister would have to come on and justify or denounce it. There'd be questions in the House of Commons. You can imagine the near total silence by the Western media. Most Western papers actually invented stories about what was happening on October the 7th. Papers which went along with the fabrications by Israeli sources, 40 beheaded babies, mass rapes, etc. on October the 7th. But at the same time, they've downplayed or scarcely reported these horrifying reports of sheer barbarity committed by Israel against Palestinian prisoners. I am puzzled that there's been so little Western reporting of this. You've had the United Nations report, which says that quite a number of these prisoners have died because they're beaten to death or just left to die. B'Tselem, which is the leading Israeli human rights group, published a devastating report based on the interviews with 50 or more prisoners, which make completely unbearable reading.
ينادوا عليه كله تعبوس كندرتي
اللي مكسور ايده اللي مكسور انفه اللي رجله
تم تكسيره في معنى الكلمه
الجندي برجله دفعني فوقعت على وجهي
فطلع نصيبنا في ضربة قوية في الأذن أفقدتني السمع تماما.
كان فيها سجين استشهد برضه خالد الشويش الله يرحمه لدرجة إنه الدودة بيطلع من جسمه وما في أي نوع من العلاج.
أخ أبو أحمد أنا تعرضت للاغتصاب بمعنى أنهم قاموا بوضع
إجري سامع خبط في إجريه يقول له قوم قوم يا حيوان قوم يا كلب. فهموا إنه هو مش قايم مش راح يقوم وأخذوه إجوا جابوه في كيس أسود.
If you are a Palestinian prisoner in one of these jails, very likely you haven't been charged with any criminal or other offence.
قتلت اخوتي قصفت دارنا اي اساس بتقول اي وين الاسرى وين ايش بعرف وين الاسرى ساقني في اماكن حساسه كان يضربني في اماكن حساسه ساقني فيها كذا مره عابت ما انا يعني لو كنت يعني اصيح زي الاطفال.
You're going to be randomly beaten, tortured. You may be sodomized, normally by metal objects. Internal organs have been smashed up and as a result.
طمل طبعا وانت مطمل بتبقى بقول هدول بيبقوا شباب وبنات الطرف في الطيز بتنحط بس لا هو الطرفه طرفه هيك خملها زي هيك القد حديد لما تفتحها زي هيك ويحط لك اياها جوا بخلي مخك يطلع.
There are 9,500 Palestinians held in Israeli jails, approximately 200 of whom are children.
I was part of the human rights vetting process for arms going to Israel, and a charity called Defense of Children International Palestine drew our attention at the State Department to the sexual assault, actually the rape of a 13-year-old boy that occurred in an Israeli prison in the Moscabia in Jerusalem. We examined these allegations. We believed they were credible. We put them to the government of Israel. And you know what happened the next day? The IDF went into the DCIP offices and removed all their computers and declared them a terrorist entity.
This is nothing new. It's been going on for a very long time, probably to the origins of the Israeli state, and then with venomous intensity ever since October the 7th. In July, I was in Jerusalem and saw this awful tape of a man, Muaz Aziz, coming out of the Negev jail in South Israel. And he was clearly unable to walk unaided. His right arm was stuck out in front of him, looked broken. I asked our bureau chief in Jerusalem if we could go and interview him, and she did. She sorted that out, and we went together. He'd never been charged with anything. I think this is very important. Nobody had accused him of a crime. He has a pregnant wife and 4 children. They came in, they smashed everything up, took him away, and basically he went through 9 months of beatings.
ينهال عليك بأجهزة التفتيش التي يفتش به الجسد، ينهال عليك بالضرب على الأعضاء التناسلية، بالضرب المبرح وأنت عارية، ينهال على الأسير وهو عاري بهروات حديدية وبأجهزة التفتيش على الأعضاء التناسلية ضربا.
In a nearby cell, somebody was beaten to death and left to die.
استشهد في غرفة 6 اسمه ثائر أبو عصب، قتلة تلك الوحدة وحدة الكيتر، بعد ما قتلوه بالضرب على رأسه بالهروات الحديدية مكث في الغرفة ساعة كاملة لم يخرجوه من الغرفة.
He said, the prison is still in my head. He was so traumatized by this experience. The other thing he said was that every other prisoner is getting the same treatment. The beatings, the torture, the starvation, the barbarity. You're not treated like human beings. He said, this is like Guantanamo or Abu Ghraib. This is what we're talking about, is Israel's Abu Ghraib moment. What we're talking about here is war crimes, very grave war crimes, the torture and abuse of prisoners. Why the ICC, despite the mountain of evidence which now exists, has been unable to look for arrest warrants against the people directing this barbarity is utterly baffling and completely wrong. By failing to act in the face of so much evidence, the International Criminal Court is itself sanctioning this gross abuse, this inhumanity which is going on all the time now in Israeli prisons. The evidence of what is happening in Israeli jails, or should we call them torture camps, shows that Israel has passed through some awful invisible barrier and is now a very sick society. The silence of mainstream media and most senior Western politicians, I'm afraid, shows that we too have entered into the same nightmare moral universe as Israel's Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir and Prime Minister Netanyahu. However uncomfortable or difficult the story is, Double Down News will cover it, unlike so much of the mainstream British media.